Hello, Internet. My name is David Dowd, and I'm a mortgage loan officer here out of Texas. And I'll go ahead and show them all my information on the screen real quick. I own my own company, David James Investments. And so definitely check out my website after this video if you'd like to work with me as your mortgage loan officer. And today we have a very special guest. This is my good friend, Jonathan, and we're going to be doing an Ask Me Anything. So he's going to ask me anything as a loan officer. I'm going to try my best to answer those questions. So hopefully this is helpful for someone who is in the market for buying a home or just has maybe some questions they need answered about buying a home or other finance related questions in relation to real estate. Hello there, Jonathan. How are you today?
All right, David, how are you doing?
Doing well, I'd say. So let's go ahead and kick it right off. What is your first question?
For my loan, I have an FHA. Can I get a lower interest rate, and what are my best options to do that?
It is possible to get a lower interest rate, and the way to do that is to refinance the home. There are two different ways to refinance. There is the cash out refinance and the refinance same term. So, a cash out refinance, what you're basically doing is you're starting your loan over again, wherever that term was at. It's going to begin again at the beginning. So, if you had a 30-year loan and you were 5 years into it, you're 25 years left to go, you're starting back at 30. But what you're going to do in a cash out refinance is you're going to get the equity, that is the money that you have already spent to own the house, right? So the ownership of the
Okay.
home, in other words, you'd be taking that out of the home and putting it into your pocket to spend it on whatever you want to spend it on. So that's a cash out refinance. And then, of course, there's the refinance that would probably make the most sense for a lot of people, which is to stay in the same term. So you were 25 years into the term in our example. You're still going to be 25 years into the term with the refinance, just with a lower interest rate. So that's a refinance, same term is what that's called. And that's how you could effectively lower your interest rate if the circumstances made financial sense to you. When the rates get low enough where that's a good idea, that's another key thing I would advise as well. Depending on where your interest rate is initially, will dictate whether or not a refinance to get a lower interest rate is a good move or not. Let's say you're at 7, right? And it's like, oh, look, it went to 6.8. Maybe that's worth it. Maybe that's not. But if it
Yeah.
jumps down an entire percentage, then that could definitely be worth it. Now, here's another thing about it with refinancing. This can not only lower your interest rate, but this can also allow you to change loan programs. So right now you're an FHA, but if you were to refinance, into, let's say, a conventional loan, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, for
Okay.
example.
Yes.
That may be potentially a better direction, depending on what the fees are, depending on what that's going to cost you. You have to look at things from the standpoint of timing as well as circumstance.
What is a FHA Streamline refinance, and how does that work?
FHA Streamline basically is where you don't have to send in any information, right? Or very little information if they do need something. It's basically saying, like, okay, hey, we've already got all of the info from the initial application. We're going to go ahead and use that info if circumstances haven't changed to go ahead and get them into a lower interest rate while still retaining an FHA loan. But yeah, Streamline in kind of a nutshell version is just they're going to use information they already have that's been stored with the FHA to get you a lower interest rate and refinance much faster than if you were just refinancing into a different loan program or what normally is expected from refinances, where we're going to ask for a bunch of information about your job and your debts and so on and so forth, your financial picture, if you will, to determine the risk of said
And
borrowers.
as far as interest rates, how often do they fluctuate?
Oh, that one can be dictated by a lot of factors, as you can imagine. What's going on in the world? What is going on with the mortgage-backed securities? The main one, in all honesty, is the mortgage-backed securities. Wherever that's at, that's the Ginnie Mae, is what that's known as. Wherever that's at, that's going to dictate what the interest rates are for housing here, at least in the United States. So if you're watching outside of the United States, it should be noted everything's a little bit different elsewhere. But here in the United States, that is how it's determined from mortgage-backed securities, which just so you know what that is in a short form, it's where banks or lenders take a bunch of mortgages that are kind of the same, they're very similar, and they put them in a pool. And that pool becomes the mortgage-backed securities. And that's what investors invest in order to get a return on their investment, right? So they say, hey, I want to invest in those mortgage backed securities. And it's that determines, okay, what are the interest rates going to be anytime in the markets? Now, of course, given that it is something that's based on a lot of circumstances, what's going on in the world can also impact things. So it's not a direct impact, but indirectly it can affect things, just like with the stock market, just like with bonds, and so on and so forth. So, yeah,
Okay.
at the end of the day, it is based on a lot of circumstances going on. in our country.
As far as refinancing, are there any out of pocket costs that can be rolled into the loan?
The vast majority of the time, they are rolled into the loan when you do a refinance so that you don't have to come to the table, the closing table, with any money down. Now, obviously, that's going to be dependent upon your situation and your circumstances. So, obviously, your mileage may vary when it comes to, am I rolling it all into the loan and is that going to be the end of it? Or, yes, I do want to pay more, so maybe I don't have to pay so much monthly. That could be another direction people could take it. Whatever it is, it's very flexible. There will be options depending on what your goals are and what you want to happen when you're doing your refinance. Actually, the biggest thing, if you're deciding to do a refinance, also make sure the numbers work. So use a calculator, talk to a loan officer like myself, and make sure that it makes sense financially. The math is to your advantage. And then second to that, what is your goal with that refinance? What is the intention? Is it just to lower the interest rate or is there more to the story?
For an FHA mortgage insurance, is it possible to remove that, or when would that drop off?
Unfortunately, for the FHA program, you cannot remove the mortgage insurance for FHA. The only way that that can happen is to refinance into a different loan product, like a conventional. Yeah, conventional is usually the direction most people go. It's like, oh, I've been having FHA for 7 years. I'm really tired of paying mortgage insurance. It's a bummer because it can never go away. In fact, there's two parts to mortgage insurance for that. There's the initial, which you pay upfront. It's called the upfront mortgage insurance. And then there's the lifetime of the loan, which you're paying mortgage insurance the whole time. And it's because of what the FHA does as a product and also as an entity. And that's the reason they always have it there. It's to back up the risk. With conventional, though, it is possible to get rid of mortgage insurance, but it's going to be dictated by some factors. If you have paid the loan to value, that's what that's called, right? So it's here's the loan amount versus the value of the home, and then how much have you paid, right? Or how much are you doing for your down payment? And actually, when you're doing your down payment or whatever creative financing you need to do to get to 80% as your loan to value, then you'll just start off without mortgage insurance, right? 80% is the big one. So let's say you started at a lower number. Let's say you started at 90%. So 90% of the home is being financed, in other words. And it's like,
Mhm.
okay, you're going to have mortgage insurance on a conventional, right? Because that is too much of a loan versus the value of the home. Now, let's say you pay it down to 80%. It's at that point you can actually call and have mortgage insurance removed by your servicer. You call them up and say, hey, I'm at a 80% loan to value. I want to remove my mortgage insurance, and they will remove it for you. So it's at 80%, you can call and remove it. And then at 78%, it automatically gets removed by the servicer. So as far as mortgage insurance and how that relates. But FHA, you will always have mortgage insurance.
In your opinion, is it better to switch to a conventional loan at that point when you have that much equity and then save money instead of being in the FHA?
Your mileage may vary. I'm going to probably answer a lot of the questions like that because depending on the circumstances, depending on the math, maybe, maybe not. In a vast majority of cases, it probably makes more sense to refinance into something that doesn't have mortgage insurance because then right there alone, you're already saving money. But you have to run the numbers and you have to make sure that if you were to refinance at that point in time, would the interest rate that you have with the FHA still be just as good as when you went to the conventional loan and the refinance in order to get rid of mortgage insurance? But then all of a sudden, maybe your interest rate goes up, right? Because maybe at that time, that point in time, the interest rates are higher. So it just depends on your circumstances. And maybe it is to your benefit to wait until the interest rates are lower and then you make that move. Because then it's like, well, then there's no question. Or if you just really hate mortgage insurance, then you could go for it anyway. It just depends on what you want to do. We can't stop you from doing it, even if it doesn't make financial sense.
Since I'm going to be staying in my FHA loan, can
Mhm.
I pass my mortgage to lower my monthly payment?
On that note, you can always talk to them and see if there's any opportunities. They will probably encourage you to do a refinance more than likely if the circumstances are beneficial. Otherwise, there are some factors that deal with what your mortgage payment is that nobody has any control over, unfortunately. The big one is taxes, right? So we can't control how much a given government entity is going to charge us in taxes for living in a certain area. That's just going to fluctuate over time, whether it's up or down. Most of the time it's up, unfortunately. Insurance is another factor that you can't control how much it's going to cost necessarily. You can always shop around. So you do have that control. But ultimately, maybe insurance goes up even if you've shopped around and that's what it's going to be. Probably had that with other insurances like auto insurance and so forth. We don't have control of those factors, right? So insurance and taxes tend to be the reasons that our mortgage payments go up. Now, this is assuming that you're in an escrow account, should be noted. But some people don't have escrow for their house payments. They just pay the interest and principal of the house by themselves and they'll pay the taxes separately on their own and their insurance on their own. In a lot of cases, people will be in escrow. Just to define that quickly, an escrow account is basically an account that you can put all of the money in to pay for all the things related to home ownership, with the exception of maintenance. That'll still be on you as the owner, one of the phantom costs in home ownership. But otherwise, it should contain your taxes. It also contains your insurance payment, whether that's mortgage insurance and property insurance, should be both of those if applicable. And also the principal and interest, which is what you would expect from the mortgage itself. So principal, of course, being the value of the home that you're paying off over time, and the interest that the bank is charging you in order to lend you that money over time. That's how they're making their money. That's everything that should be contained in there. Sometimes you have the HOA, so that's the homeowners association fee. Sometimes that's in the mix. Otherwise, that's pretty much everything that goes into escrow.
Well,
So,
that answers the next question then,
oh,
which from 30 years to 15 years, would it be beneficial?
sort of answered the question there. That depends. So the benefits, let's talk about that. Benefits of the 15 year. You pay it off in 15 years, right?
Exactly.
You own your home in 15 years. So that's pretty cool. And then, of course, the advantage to a 30-year loan, you have a longer time frame, 30 years as opposed to 15, that'd be half the time, right? What I would say is when we're comparing the two, 15-year mortgage to the 30-year mortgage, the 15-year mortgage is going to have a much higher monthly payment because it's half the time as the 30-year. But it will have a better interest rate because it means that the bank will get their money sooner than later. They don't have to wait 30 years, they don't have to wait 15. So they're going to give you probably a much more desirable interest rate. Whereas a 30-year, it's not going to be as good as the 15-year in most cases. So
Okay.
that's another thing to kind of consider and look at.
In terms of wanting to pay off my mortgage early,
Mhm.
what are the options and are there any penalties?
You could pay your principal ahead of time. I know that based on the math, if you were to pay your principal double, so basically you look at your mortgage bill and you say, okay, how much of this payment is principal? You look at your bill, you say, oh, okay, it's let's say it's like, I don't know, $313. And
Okay.
you say, cool, I'm gonna pay that twice for this bill. If you did that every single payment every month, I will effectively pay the mortgage off in half the time, whatever time frame you're in, depending on when you start doing it, if you did it from the get-go versus if you did that midway, that kind of thing. But it cuts the time substantially because again, you're paying the principal to reduce the interest, and that too can lower the payment sort of. It's like it'll be the same payment amount every time. It's just more of it's going to principal as opposed to interest.
Yes.
Now, depending on your interest rate, maybe you can end up using the money instead of paying ahead or paying it off sooner, you could invest that money into something that gets you a higher return than whatever your interest rate is. Because that's the way you have to look at it too. Is like, well, hey, what am I missing out on by paying off my home sooner than later? You have to look at the interest rate, right? So say your interest rate is, let's say you're back from 2021, and your interest rate is like 3%. Well, if I pay off the house in its full amount, and I do that in record time, let's say 10 years, then really I'm just getting a 3% return on my investment. For just talking about the numbers, we're not talking psychology, we're not talking emotions. That's a whole nother thing. You're getting a 3% return on your money. Whereas if that money was instead being put into the house and paying off your mortgage faster, was put into the S&P 500, maybe an index fund, and whatever that return is, may be bigger. Traditionally, the market gives back about somewhere between 7 and 11%. If we're calculating inflation, which is always going to be there, most people say about 7% is the return. So your 3% of your home loan versus 7% return on the S&P 500 being invested, you have to kind of pick and choose your battles. Something to consider. Is there a penalty? Well, that depends on your lender. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So make sure you always check that before you pay ahead. Don't want anybody getting fees unnecessarily just because they didn't read the fine print. Another thing that people do is they'll make one extra payment every year. They don't do it in the breakdown like we're used to, like we'd seen in escrow, where it's broken into four different pieces, right? Your
Yes.
principal, your interest, your insurance, and your taxes. Instead, they take what is their mortgage amount, the payment, they save that up over time, and they make a 13th payment in the year, maybe in December, maybe November, somewhere towards the tail end, and they just pay it all towards the principal of the home. The math works out so that pays off the home in about 22 years. So if it's a 30-year loan, for example, in about 22 years. So it'll save you about 8 years, which is not bad. But
No.
22 years, right? So you have to, again, pick and choose your battle. That's another direction people tend to go. 21, 22 years, that'll pay it off. You pay a 13th payment every year. Aside from that, if you just pay more of the principal over time, even if it's more than whatever your principal is, like we talked about in the first strategy, say you pay
Okay.
$1,000 towards the principal every few months. Maybe it's
Yeah.
every quarter. So you're doing that. That'll pay it off faster than 22 years, even because that's probably larger than the 13th payment, right? So there's a few different ways of going about it. At the end of the day, though, your goal is the principal. As long as you're attacking the principal, the loan will get paid off faster.
If I plan to sell my house in a couple of years or the next few years,
Okay.
should I finance in that time or not? Oh,
If you're
okay.
going to sell the home, you probably get back the money that you would have paid into it equity wise. That's what they call that, right? You probably
Yes.
get that back from selling the home. Vast majority of the time, refinance and selling, they kind of defeat each other's purposes, right? Because at the end of the day, you're going to get money from either of those directions. Most
Oh,
likely, you'd be refinancing for that reason, I'd assume. Is that right?
yes.
Okay.
Uh,
So you probably
so
selling is your better route.
how about would refinancing affect my credit at all?
Well, there is a hard credit pull that's done anytime that we're dealing with mortgages. So
Okay.
yes, but it'd be very subtle. I
Oh,
wouldn't say it'd be huge unless you've had like 13 credit pulls in a very short period of time. Then maybe it could be detrimental. Mileage may vary there too. That'd be the only way I could think of that it would impact credit. If it's more money that you're going to have to owe, then that could be that utilization, perhaps. So there's some potential impacts there, but the biggest one is the credit pull, in my opinion.
are there any government programs or help financing a home improvement on an FHA?
Yeah, there's a few FHA programs and they're always changing all the time. So I definitely check the HUD.gov, I believe is the website. Check their website, check and see what they have. There are a few options. I believe it's a 203K, if I remember off the top of my head correctly. And that is a renovation loan that you can get as the actual loan itself. So basically, it allows a person to have an excess of money in order to do repairs on the home. And a lot of times it'll be taking equity out of the home in order to do those repairs. So sometimes, a lot of times I should say, people do a refinance in order to renovate the home. So they'll do a cash out refinance. And in doing that, they'll take that money and instead of using it all willy nilly for whatever, they'll end up using it to renovate the home to bring up its value. Right. So they do an appraisal. And a lot of times, if there's that intention ahead of time, they can even bring that up with the appraisers, bring that up with their planning. And then that way, the home's value can show an increase. If they've already got the contract with whoever's going to do the work, right? The contractors, they're going to go out there, do the work. They have everything all lined item and organized. Then that can also help for the appraisals, the value of the home to instantly go up from those renovations. So something to consider. But yeah, definitely check the HUD website for more on FHA programs they offer because they may have new ones for all we know at this time. It's always good to check.
What documents do I need to start like filling out to start a refinance process? And roughly how long does it take?
Usually, as far as the rough, if we're getting really on top of things, anywhere from say 10 to 14 days is probably one of the faster refinances. If the streamline might be even faster than that, because again, you don't have to provide any information, they're using information already provided. So maybe a week. But ultimately, documents wise, whenever it comes to mortgages, you're always going to want to have any information related to your work, so your income, any information related to your debts, so what you owe on things, any information related to your assets, so things that you own that have value. Even cash on hand can be considered an asset. You cannot use that to buy a home because we don't know where the money came from, but you can say, hey, I've got this much cash under my mattress, and they can say, okay, cool, that's an asset that can be used to make a mortgage payment, so that can help to lower risk, your risk profile.
That would
Was that?
mean that use that money to maybe lower the interest rate, maybe?
Perhaps, yeah. Again, the risk profiling can help to determine what interest rates they offer you. So
Okay.
if you're seen as less risky, they can provide you more favorable interest rates. Other information I would always recommend, especially when we're dealing with mortgages, is to know your credit profile. So check your credit and you can also check your credit scores. So as far as resources there is a free one at least once a year and definitely look into that as far as just reviewing your credit report. That won't show your scores, bear in mind. To view your scores, you can try creditkarma.com. That's a free one. It's not 100% accurate, but it's free. The other one
Gives
would be
you
myfico.com is the one that is 100% accurate, but there is a fee behind it.
gives you an idea of where you're going to be at.
If you're just looking for generally where am I at, then I'd say go Credit Karma. So that way you can at least see it, review your credit report. That's some of the documents, some of the things to be more familiar with as you decide to refinance or even purchase a home. Well, it's really either direction.
Say something happens to me or some type of financial hardship happens. Do I have options that are available to me?
Right. There's definitely going to be some flexibility for financial hardships. You'll need to reach out to the mortgage servicer. So whoever you're paying your mortgage bill to, that's who the servicer is. Reach out to them and see what programs they have available for hardships. So if you were disabled from work, if you got sick with something, big life change, right? Think of it, big life change. And then see if they offer any programs, whether that's to push the payments further down the line, like they did during COVID for some companies, or perhaps they forgive parts of the loan. I'm not really sure if that one's too popular because then they end up losing out on money, but
For sure.
who knows?
Can
Sure.
I request an appraisal waiver if I refinance, or do I need a new home appraisal?
They're probably going to want to do another appraisal because circumstances may have changed and what value of the home it is may have also changed. And so that's the reason. Appraisals are just opinions of a person who has been trained in how to appraise a home. So you could get your home appraised by several people and they probably all have different answers. You got to keep that in mind too. You can always dispute appraisals if you have good evidence to dispute it and bring that up. And that can always be something you can kind of negotiate if it's even possible. Like I said, anytime it comes to refinancing or buying a home for the first time, an appraisal, vast majority of the time, is going to be needed.
If I were to renovate my home, does that increase my mortgage payment significantly, or are there options to where it doesn't allow my mortgage payment to rise?
Yeah. If you do a home renovation, it's not going to impact the agreement that you have already with whatever your mortgage is. So let's say, as an example, you have your home, you're 5 years into your 30-year loan, you decide to put a pool in the backyard. That's going to increase its value. So
Yes.
it's like, cool, your mortgage isn't going to change just because you did that. But here's the thing. If you get the home reappraised, so you have an appraiser come out and get a new value of your home with the pool, then that gives you additional equity. And why that's advantageous is then that can allow you to have more wiggle room if you want to do like a cash out refinance, for example. You
Okay.
wanted more money out of the home, you've renovated the home, you've already paid for your pool, that was its own separate deal. I want to get that money out of my house now. So I'm 5 years in, but I want to do a refinance and I want to cash out. So I want to get the value of that pool in the house along with what I've already paid. So I can use that for something else. It adds additional equity. So if your home's value goes up naturally, plus you added the pool, then that's kind of cool too. So just something to keep in mind.
What are the main mistakes people make when refinancing, and how can I avoid them?
Well, the biggest one, of course, is not running the numbers. They see that their interest rate goes down and they just immediately want to do it. They don't actually look and say, okay, well, how much money is this actually saving me every month? And what is the real cost in doing this? There's going to be fees and there's going to be closing costs involved. And even if it's rolled into the loan, you still got to pay that eventually, right? Got to run the numbers. The biggest mistake I've seen is that people don't run the numbers. They just see advantage of a lower interest rate. They see a lower monthly payment and immediately think, okay, that's fantastic. Let's go. Especially if they're keeping it on the same term. And maybe that's all they really care about anyway. Cash out refinances, you probably find people making more mistakes in that direction because now you have to start the loan over again. Instead of you're on year 25, you're 5 years in other words, and you cash out refinance, you get that money. You're like, oh, cool, I want to get that money. Awesome. Then you're back to 30 years again. So
Okay.
it's like as if you just bought the home again.
Say I plan to retire in 10, 20 years. What
Okay.
would be the best strategy to pay off my mortgage?
Fortunately, you'd have yourself a time frame. So that's the first advantage. Now you can calculate how much more extra principal you need to be paying every single month for those 10, 15 years, however long it is, right before your retirement, in order to ensure that your house is paid off by that time. That goes back to what we talked about earlier, though, of is paying off your home mathematically the best option versus investing it somewhere else? That opportunity cost. Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah,
But again, that's just mathematically and logically speaking. That's not emotionally speaking. Now, emotions is a whole nother place. It's like, well, what's that feeling you have when you're living in your home and it's paid off and you're all you're worrying about is the insurance, the maintenance, and the taxes? It's a different kind of feeling.
absolutely.
Maybe, maybe that's worth, that opportunity cost. to each their own. Everyone's journey is a little bit different. Personal finance is personal for a reason. And so if that's a feeling that you get and you know it's going to bring you a lot of peace, then I suggest you pay off the home. And in this case, before you retire. So that way you're retired and your home's paid off. Hey, you can celebrate both reasons or even pay it off sooner, depending on how you feel about it. And also depending on if you can wing that financially speaking. That's what I would say as far as retirement goes. Definitely a great retirement goal. That's what I would say personally, but depends on what else you have going on as well. Maybe you've got an entire empire of rental real estate or got your house paid off. Great. Now you can use that home being paid off as a means to invest in other things. So you then use the equity of your home in order to invest in other real estate or maybe a business or something else. Again, it's always important to run the numbers. It's always important to, after you've ran the numbers, to then go, how do I feel about it? Am I feeling okay? Am I feeling kind of, I need more information. Don't let the fact that there's a lot of information that's involved here stop you from taking action. Always try to take one step at a time to progress to say, okay, do I need to take an action? And if I do, how do I feel about it? Like really go through it. And then at that point, you can decide, okay, I can pay it off by retirement. Fantastic. Now that I've paid it off, what's next? Is there anything next? Or do I just want to be where I'm at?
Say I pay off my house. How much of my house can I take money out of and use elsewhere? And are there penalties on that?
Well, it depends on the lender. Some lenders will go as high as 80%. Some will go, I don't know if they go higher than 80%. Some might. So there may be some higher risk folks that are down for that. But
Okay.
ultimately, you've paid off 100% of your home, which means there's 100% equity of your home, whatever the value of your home is, at that point in time. So for a lot, generally about 80%, and they're going to look at everything. So like credit, your risk, so on and so forth, because again, they're giving you money and they're going to expect that money back in some way. So that's why they're going to do that. You would then take that money and do with it what you will, but you're going to have another mortgage payment if you do that. So keep that in mind. If you locked in your rate, so that's what they call that when it's like, okay, time needs to pass, but I'd like to retain where I'm at with what was offered. I'm going to lock in that rate. It's been locked in. Then, depending on that lender's clause on how they work lock-ins, maybe it gets lower because they have to go with, if it goes lower during the lock period, maybe that's a feature, a clause of their agreement, the contract, maybe not. So be careful of that. Or you can risk what's called floating. That's what they call that. When you don't lock it in, the rate is floating. When you're coming to the closing table, whatever that rate is at that time, it's that rate.
Well, I appreciate all your answers for today. I really do. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for joining me today on this session. Everyone watching, again, like the video if you got important information out of that, if you learned something new. And again, if this is your first video watching, please consider subscribing. It does us great. Here's my information on the screen right now. And again, my name is David Dowd. I'm a loan officer out of Texas with my own company, David James Investments. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. I appreciate having you.
No problem, David. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Everyone, take care and be blessed. And until next time, guys, take care.